Welcome to Constitution Day 2024. I am Kirk Higgins, and I am joined by my colleague,
Rachel Davison Humphries. Nice to see you all. Thanks for being here and joining us today on this very auspicious day. Kirk, what are we here for today?
So we're here again to talk about Constitution Day, as we have been for the past 5 years, which is really exciting that we've been doing our Constitution Day live programming. And this year, we're going to focus on the Constitution and debate, dialogue, disagreement, and how we're built to overcome all of these things.
And I love that theme. I think we really are built for this. America as an institution knew that we would have a pluralist, dynamic, different society from the very beginning. And so there are institutions that help us support all the work we're doing to come together through difference.
Absolutely. And disagreement isn't a bug in our constitutional system. It's actually a feature. It's something that happens when we're all free to think and act as we see fit. And it's something that is enabled by our constitutional system. And so today we're going to dive deeply into that. What it means to disagree, how it is we can come to consensus and overcome that disagreement in order to move forward together as a country. To help us unpack this theme further, we're joined by a great slate of guests, starting with Yuval Levin from the American Enterprise Institute, who's going to talk about how the Constitution helps unify us.
And then we'll go to Eric Meyer, publisher of the Marion County Reporter. If you're not familiar with this story ripped from the headlines about freedom of the press and the courage it takes to really stand up for it in the modern day, you're going to want to make sure you check out that segment.
We're also going to hear from our student fellows who ask some excellent questions that are going to be answered by Professor Mark Rozell about how our constitutional system works.
Then we're going down to Dr. Jane Kamensky, Professor Emeritus of History from Harvard and now President of Monticello. And you all went down there to interview her.
We did. It was great, and it's an excellent conversation, and I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you all. And then finally, we're going to sit down with Dr. Condoleezza Rice, who was formerly Secretary of State and now is the director of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Dr. Rice was very generous with her time and had some great things to say about leadership and what it means to be a part of civil society.
And it's such an honor that she came on our program for an interview. And then at the very end, so last but very much not least, we are proud to announce the National Civics Teacher of the Year right here on Constitution Day.
That's right, that'll be our concluding moment. So I hope you'll stick around and find out. We're really excited to honor another excellent teacher this year. So our first conversation today is going to be with Yuval Levin. And our colleague Tony Williams sat down with Yuval to talk about how it is that constitutional systems, specifically our constitutional system, can bring people together and overcome the disagreement that emerges in a free society. But how we go about doing that is really the question and the challenge.
And it is a challenge because of the pluralism, of the complexity of our communities. You know, we have layers upon layers of federalism and layers upon layers of our responsibilities that we have to different groups. So how do we come together with all of that difference?
That's right, yeah, disagreement is something that just naturally occurs. We all have different views and opinions on different things. So the question is, how do we overcome that disagreement in order to find consensus and work to move together? And Yuval says it really starts by us looking at the Constitution as more than just a set of laws that govern how it is that our constitutional framework works, which it is that, but it's also more. It also signals to us as a polity or a self-governing community how it is that we ought to work and live together. And so I hope you'll enjoy this conversation between Tony and Yuval as they unpack that even further.
Yuval Levin is the director of the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he holds a chair in public policy. He's the author of several books, including A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream, which we discussed on a previous episode of Scholar Talks. And his latest book is the excellent American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I am pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks in the Topics in American Government and Civics series. Yuval, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Tony. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I love American Covenant, and I mean it's so well written. It's a compelling read. Such an important topic, but I'll tell you, most importantly, while I was reading it, I had a sense of hope. I had a sense of confidence that that will be okay. that whatever divisions might exist in American society and politics, that we have the tools already at our disposal, constitutionally and otherwise, to find some common ground. So it was a very, very hopeful message.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. Hope is in a way at the very center of the book. It's not optimistic exactly. I don't simply think everything is going to be fine, but I think that we have the resources to improve our situation, and that's what hope looks like to me.
Right. Good. So why don't we start with the problem? So what is the problem today? Why does politics, why do we seem sort of so dysfunctional and disunited and divided today?
I think one way to think about the nature of the problem that we have today is that we've forgotten the art of coalition building. In a sense, of course, the problem we have is that we're divided, we're polarized. A lot of Americans feel alienated from each other, isolated from each other. And sometimes we even blame our Constitution, our political system, for contributing to that, for sharpening our divisions. But in fact, when you look at our Constitution, as I try to do in this book, it turns out that bringing a divided people together is actually one of its core purposes, one of its chief aims. And when the Constitution describes its own purposes in the preamble, the first thing it says is that it exists to form a more perfect union. And at the heart of its approach to doing that is a way of compelling differing, competing factions in American life to deal with each other. Through negotiation, through competition. All of that involves ways of building coalitions. Coalition building is really a way of turning minorities into majorities, of making majorities larger and more durable and more legitimate. That work is at the heart of what our vision of political life is all about. And in 21st century America, we've gotten really bad at it. We have forgotten what it looks like to work together with people that we don't entirely agree with about everything, where we can see paths toward common action, toward agreed modes of action. We don't have to agree about every underlying premise. And ways of doing that are what Congress is for, they're what federalism is for, they're what our party system is for. And all of those institutions are now in bad shape. I think we've been losing the knack for coalition building. And I would say, ultimately, that knack is not about learning to agree with each other. Contemporary Americans are actually pretty good at agreeing with people they agree with. We spend most of our time with people we agree with, talking about people we disagree with. What we've forgotten how to do is how to disagree. And that is what the Constitution really can teach us to do in a practical way, to live with disagreement, to work through it, and ultimately to arrive at modes of common action despite disagreement. We've forgotten how to do that, and that is, I think, the problem in contemporary American political life.
Right, and you've touched upon this a little bit already, but you argue, I think very interestingly, that the Constitution is just much more than just a legal framework. It is that, but it's much more. So, although you've touched upon it a little bit, so if you can expand upon a little bit more, and how can the Constitution actually help unify Americans?
Yeah, the Constitution is law, as you say. That's one of the things it is, and it's the supreme law of the land, as it says itself in Article 6. But it would be a mistake to leave the Constitution to lawyers and judges. It isn't just law. It ultimately describes a polity. It describes a way of living together as free people. And a lot of what it offers us beyond law, as a legal framework, the Constitution is a set of boundaries and constraints. But it also offers us ways of resolving disputes that fundamentally revolve around negotiation, competition, kind of constructive tension, all of which let us work through differences toward common action. And I think there's an idea of unity at the center of the constitutional framework that says in a free society, unity doesn't mean thinking alike, it means acting together, which is a framework that I think forces us to ask, how actually can we act together when we don't think alike? And the Constitution, beyond law, is an answer to that question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? We do it through negotiating, we do it through bargaining, we do it through competing, and ultimately we do it through the institutions. We do it through federalism and Congress and the presidency and the courts. And I think to see that is not only to see how we might do better as a practical matter, but also to understand what it means to live together as a free people that are always going to be characterized by disagreements. So that to be reacquainted with the Constitution, which is what this book really tries to offer readers, I think is to be reacquainted with that vision that says unity doesn't mean unanimity. The fact that we disagree doesn't mean we have to be at war with each other. There are ways to live together despite these differences.
Right, great. And something I found really fascinating is how can federalism and a greater sense of localism actually promote greater unity among Americans?
Yeah, federalism, I think, is often misunderstood now, even by some of its defenders. There's a tendency to think about federalism as describing a layered government, where there's a higher level at the national level, there's a lower level at the local level, and we say, where should the power be? And that was one of the ways that the convention that created the Constitution began, by thinking about the state and the national. But ultimately, they didn't come to an agreement on that sort of federalist arrangement. There was a dispute about whether the states should be governing the people directly, in which case the national government would just be a kind of confederation like the UN, or whether the national government should govern the people directly, in which case the states would just be administrative districts like counties. And ultimately, they didn't come to an agreement on that question. They instead decided to do both at the same time. The states and the national government both govern the people directly. They do it when it comes to different issues, to different domains of life. And so we don't have a layered government. We have two parallel tracks of governing. A national track where the national government does govern the people directly, but only regarding a few issues: national security and diplomacy, economic policy, and since the post-Civil War amendments, also the protection of core equal rights. And the states govern in other domains, in all other domains. The basic police powers of government belong to the states. That separation allows for genuine diversity of governance and therefore genuine diversity of ways of life in American political life. I think that we have gradually lost that sense that what we have are two parallel tracks of government, and instead we've had a kind of intermixing of governing powers, particularly in education, in welfare, and in healthcare. And in all those areas, that intermixing has not been good. It's not been good for American government, I would argue. It's also not been good for our cohesion and our unity. And I think that a forward-looking agenda of federalism reform would involve a lot of pulling apart these governing powers, of undoing that intermixing. And even if there are more areas now that we think should be under the national government's control, we have to see that there should not be areas where both states and the national government govern at the same time, where the states are spending federal money, where the federal government is using the states as basically administrators. Our system does not work well that way. And when we do it, it makes it impossible for us to have diverse forms of government simultaneously, which is ultimately how federalism lets us live together better.
Right. And something I think was so critical to the book is looking at the Constitution, the role of Congress, right? And so why is the first branch of government, the Congress, so central to restoring unity today?
Yeah, I think this is really important to understand in this moment when it's so easy to look at Congress as dysfunctional, as sort of secondary, especially to the presidency. We live in a republic, and in a Republican form of government, and the framers say this over and over, particularly in the Federalist Papers, in a Republican form of government, the legislative power necessarily is the predominant power. It's the most representative, and we have ultimately a democratic government. But it's also the place where bargaining and negotiation can really happen as a practical matter. And a government that is framed around the need to negotiate through differences is going to put the legislature at its center. When Congress is working, negotiation is at the center of the system, and the system works well. When Congress is failing, the entire system is failing. And I think that's a moment we're living in now. Congress is not doing its fundamental job of bargaining toward agreed upon modes of government very well. And as a result, a lot of power has flowed to the executive and to the judiciary. And increasingly, members of Congress are willfully giving over their power to the other branches choosing not to exercise the authority they have. And the result of that is much greater division. Congress is the only venue at the national level where we can really have a politics of bargaining and negotiation. If we don't do that, we can't have it anywhere. We have administrative agencies that pretend to engage in bargaining and negotiation, but that's not really what they're doing. And the president is not a representative job. Certainly the courts can't do that. So I think we have to see that in order for our politics to facilitate negotiation and the resolution of differences, let us be more united while we disagree. Our government has to have a more functional Congress at its center. The first branch is first for a reason.
Right, and just as a follow-up, it really seems like in this zero-sum game of politics, where any win for the other side is a loss for you, and vice versa. That there's just no idea that one would actually compromise or negotiate or engage in that kind of constructive politics.
Exactly, the cultural incentives in our politics now all push against that kind of logic. And ultimately, we have to change some of those incentives by changing the electoral system. We can talk about that. But we also have to think about how Congress functions and the kinds of incentives and signals that it sends to its own members about what success looks like. I think we've had an excessive centralization of power in Congress where the leaders make all the decisions and all the members do is talk. And if all you do is talk, then you really do want a more confrontational political system because your voters want to hear you disagree with the other side. If you don't have something else to offer them, like negotiated legislation that actually advances their interests and meets their needs, then you do end up in a purely performative kind of political culture. And that increasingly is what Congress looks like.
Interesting. All right. So what roles might the president and the Supreme Court play in unifying Americans?
I think it's easy to get confused about those because we have come to think of the president's job as a kind of second legislature. As existing to represent the entire nation all at once and as existing to advance public policy in a particular direction. I think that's very much at odds with how the framers of the Constitution thought about the presidency. The president is one person, and one person cannot represent 300 million people. To really be representative, you need a plural institution like the U.S. Congress. The president's job is administrative, and the president is elected in order to be accountable, not in order to be representative. When we think about the role the president can play in facilitating greater cohesion and unity, I think that has more to do with providing a stable backdrop for American political life and public life. The president has the responsibility to secure both the defense and safety of the public and also a stable set of conditions for American life, what Alexander Hamilton calls steady administration, which is so far from how we now think about the nature of administration, where a new president comes in, the first thing he does is undoes half of what his predecessor did and then do all kinds of things that his successor is going to undo. That creates enormous instability. But it also, when you look at it from the point of view of cohesion and unity, it means that the stakes of our presidential elections are unnaturally high. So much changes with a new president that it seems like everything's at stake in a presidential election. And that raises the temperature, that raises the divisiveness. It almost makes it true when people say that everything depends on this election. It's very important that that not be true. And the American system is built to make that less true. Not everything depends on any one election. But the more power we hand over to the president and the more that presidents think in terms of a kind of partisan direction setting rather than securing stability, the more that they damage our potential for cohesion. I think there's something similar to say about the courts. In one sense, courts obviously resolve disputes. That's what they do. But the federal courts are not meant to resolve the underlying disputes at the core of American political life. They resolve disputes about what the law is, not what the law should be. And our real disputes, our political disputes, are, of course, about what the law should be. Those are resolved in Congress. Those are resolved by competition between Congress and the president. They're not resolved by the courts. The role the courts have in advancing the cause of unity and cohesion is ultimately to secure the system, to make sure that the various constitutional actors are playing the roles assigned to them in our Constitution, and that nobody is doing an end run around the system, not presidents, not Congress, but also not majorities, right? The courts enforce our basic rights, the rights in the Bill of Rights and elsewhere, in such a way that they constrain majority power and they constrain the other actors in the system. It's only when the courts see that as their role that they can facilitate greater unity and cohesion. I think the federal courts have actually gotten better at that in the last generation or so, and especially in the last 10 years. But it's important that we see their role that way and not think of them as just another way to advance our policy objectives. There are other places in the system to do that, but that's not what the courts are for.
Right. So you mentioned lowering the temperature during elections. We're obviously right in the middle of a campaign. It's become a very interesting campaign, a very contested election. And minute by minute, you hear it's the most important one in history, as you just said. But ironically, as you point out in the book, how can stronger parties and these contested elections actually be sources of unity?
Yeah. I started out saying that coalition building is the skill we've forgotten, and political parties exist above all to facilitate coalition building. Because of the nature of our system, and especially the nature of presidential selection, we've almost always had two parties. That's largely because you don't want more than two candidates in the Electoral College. That tends to send things to the Congress, and the House is not where the president should be chosen if we can help it. So we've generally had two parties, and that means that each of them has to be a very broad and messy coalition. And that actually is good for producing the kinds of politicians who are going to be good at coalition building in the institutions of the constitutional system too, in Congress and elsewhere. So broadly speaking, the parties as institutions actually reduce partisanship, ironically enough, because a political party has to get people elected in the Deep South and in the Northwest. And so as an institution, it needs to be broadly appealing. It needs to give people room to make broad coalitional appeals. And that does tend to lower the temperature of our politics. Part of the reason that things have gotten more partisan and polarized in the last 25 years is that the parties have gotten weaker, not stronger. And they are now very weak as institutions because they've turned over a lot of their power to primary electorates. So they're not really in the business of selecting candidates anymore. They're not really in the business of directing resources to campaigns. Money flows through different channels now. The parties have much less of a role than they used to as institutions. They've, in a sense, become brands, and they're wielded by individual political actors rather than operating as coalition builders. That has been very bad for our system, and I do think that both parties need to rethink the logic of the primary system. How do we get candidates who are likely to win general elections? That is no longer the question that the candidate selection process seems to be asking. Instead, we're asking, how do we get candidates who are most satisfying to the most partisan people in our coalition, the 10% or so who vote in primaries? I think that is the wrong question for our constitutional system, and the parties have to think about how to strengthen themselves as institutions, and in that way, how to contribute to a more cohesive national political culture too.
Right. So it really seems like we're appealing to the base and to the passions of our bases rather than the general electorate, rather than appealing to all Americans, as someone who might be a good public official.
Yeah, I mean, I think our electoral politics now begin every election cycle by asking the question, what do the most devoted voters in each party want? Or you might say, what do the craziest people in America want, right? The 10% of people who vote in primaries, and I'm one of them, really care about politics a lot. But they are not like the rest of the electorate. And the party's job is to win general elections. So by starting every cycle by asking themselves, what do the people who are going to vote anyway want? They're making a mistake. They're hurting themselves. And you can see it. Neither party has been successful, really, in the last quarter century or so. We've had two minority parties at the same time now for almost 30 years, since the mid-1990s. And neither of them can seem to get out of this. They both think winning just barely 50% plus one voter is the only way to get anywhere. But they're mistaken about that. If you build a broader coalition, you can win a broader victory. But you do have to disappoint your primary voters some in doing that, which means you have to think about how to choose candidates in a way that looks beyond only that very narrow electorate.
Yeah, and one more follow-up. It just seems like each party is about 2 years to just kind of ram their agenda down everyone's throat before they're voted out, and then the other side does the same thing.
We've had no durable majority party, which is very unusual in American history. That's not normally how this works. And every time a party wins narrowly, they persuade themselves that now we're in a new political era and it's going to belong to us. And then 2 years later, they lose everything. And they somehow don't see that this is not working, that they have to think about how to change their own processes to get back to a place where we can have a durable majority for a generation at a time, as American politics generally has. They can. I think the first party to see its way out of this rut is going to do very well indeed, and be the next majority party in American life. But at this point, neither of them seems open to seeing it.
Right. Right. Well, final question, ending on a very hopeful note, I think. So you argue, and I think you've alluded to it already, unity is not unanimity. It's not the absence of disagreement. It's not even necessarily tranquility or calm. So what does greater unity, in your view, in American politics and society, what would that actually look like?
Yeah, unanimity is certainly impossible. In a free society, we're not always going to agree. If you've ever gotten a group of people of any size together, then you know that what they do is disagree. That's fine. That's freedom. The question is, how can we understand ourselves as one society as we work out differences about what we ought to be doing together? We don't do everything together, but politics is about what shall we do? And it is about working through disagreements about that question. And so I think if we can see that unity doesn't mean thinking alike, unity means acting together, then we see that a more unified politics looks like a politics that addresses itself to tractable problems, that is, to problems where I can give you some and you can give me some, and we can both, at the end of the day, think we've gotten something significant. And to do it in a way that involves negotiation and coalition building. That's what a unified politics looks like. It's not a politics where we stop disagreeing with each other. It's a politics where we start disagreeing constructively, where rather than talking about each other, we're talking to each other, and we're working through the institutions to facilitate various modes of negotiated policy outcomes. That's not impossible. That's what the life of democracy looks like. There are many examples that we can point to in American life. We don't do it enough now, and we've got to rediscover the mode of political action that looks like that. To me, that's the reason to become reacquainted with the American Constitution. And that kind of reacquaintance is ultimately the purpose of this book.
Right, great. So more Aristotle and more Madison, more Lincoln, and less social media. How about that? So we can get back to having a beer with each other and talk about politics. So it sounds great. Well, Yuval, thank you very much for joining us and discussing this important topic. Congratulations on your brilliant new book. Highly recommended, American Covenant.
Are you a young person already making a difference in your community? Take your impact further with the MyImpact Challenge from the Bill of Rights Institute. In this contest for U.S. or U.S. military-based teens aged 13 to 19, the MyImpact Challenge is your chance to share your project and gain national recognition. With up to $10,000 for your project and $40,000 in total prizes for students and teachers, your efforts can reach new heights. The MyImpact Challenge is your platform to showcase how you're making change happen. Visit myimpactchallenge.org to learn more and get started. That was a great conversation between Tony and Yuval Levin. I was especially interested in the distinction between unity and unanimity. And I really enjoyed how they discussed how every layer of government has a responsibility for that unity. Whether it's Congress, the president, and the parties, every layer of civil society takes on an aspect to make sure that those freedoms are preserved. So now we're going to take a moment and go to Stan Swim and Eric Meyer, publisher of the Marion County Record. If you're not familiar with this story, it is a story ripped from the headlines about our First Amendment right to freedom of the press. You know, our Constitution values free exchange of ideas, yet protecting that freedom has always required individuals to stand up to authority. Eric Meyer, publisher of the Marion County Reporter, shares how he stood up for freedom of the press. We're going to explore the role of journalism in our democracy, the challenges it faces, and the courage to defend it.
After the ratification of our Constitution, our nation was very quick to add 10 amendments, and the very first one of those, at least as we have them listed now, deals with the freedom of the press, how we manage information, the exchange of ideas in our society. Those words have been important throughout our nation's history. They don't execute themselves. They don't just magically mean that everything is going to go okay. And I'm joined today by someone who has paid a certain price personally and demonstrated some real courage in assertion of that First Amendment right with his local newspaper, the Marion County Record. Eric Meyer is the publisher of that paper, and it's my pleasure to interview him today. Eric, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to speak to our audience.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it.
Journalism seems to have been a lifelong passion for you. How did that start?
Oh, geez. I've been a news nerd as long as I've been alive, really. But I didn't decide I really wanted to go into it until my senior year in college, when I actually saw what it did while I was editor of my student newspaper. But I'm a third generation journalist. My grandmother was one of the first who sort of escaped the pink collar ghetto at daily newspapers and was out of the women's section and covering real news. And I used to go down and visit her in the newsroom of the Wichita Eagle before I knew how to read and write. But I saw all these people down there grabbing these pieces of paper and these big fat pencils and scrawling stuff on the paper and then going over and putting it into a pneumatic tube and sending it off to the composing room. So I went one day while I was visiting her and she was busy writing her story. I went through a wastebasket and found a bunch of old copy and marked it all up, even though I couldn't read, and sent it up to the composing room. And eventually the composing room foreman comes down and says, "What are we supposed to do with this stuff?" But that was the start of things. Even as a little kid, one of my favorite toys was I had a block of wood that I'd stapled a piece of string around, and a long string on the bottom was my lavalier microphone. And as a kid growing up in Kansas, one of the things you did all summer was spend half the summer in the basement being chased away by tornadoes. And I was fascinated by these guys who got on television and told us how to save our lives by getting in the basement. And I thought, that's kind of cool. That's what Superman and Batman and Captain Kirk and G.I. Joe are doing. And I wanted to play that too. So I did things like, when I was playing by myself, I made news sets with various different things, and it continued on. I sort of lost my interest in broadcast at some point, and the first term paper we had to write in school, when you have to learn how to do footnotes and all that kind of stuff, was mine was on modern newspaper design. So I was. My father was in the business. He was running this newspaper, as a matter of fact. My grandmother was in the business. She retired and came to work at this newspaper. And I was always planning, though, to go to college and go off and be a lawyer and an MBA and be some corporate, thank God I never did it. I would have hated that. But I became editor of my campus newspaper, and seeing the effect that journalism had on an actual community firsthand convinced me that this is what I really wanted to do forever. So I decided when I was a senior in college that forget the law school, forget the MBA stuff. Let's go off and be a journalist.
Can you remember any particular stories that stand out from your time as a college journalist where you really saw the impact and the bug bit?
Probably the best thing we ever did was one of the nice things about college journalism is that very often you have lots of reporters. So I was running as the campus editor before I was editor-in-chief. I had 75 reporters. There's stuff you can do with 75 reporters that you can't do in most newsrooms. And so we sent people out to cover all sorts of beats that we weren't really interested in. The public school system in town, we really didn't care about that. But one of the reporters came back with an interesting story of a special Skinnerian behavior analysis Head Start program in which children were literally being abused. They were forcing these kids to get tokens if they wanted to go to the bathroom, and so they'd sit them in the corner and they were wetting their pants. And if the parents complained about it, they'd threaten the kids. And there were rumors that they were going out and faking their expense accounts. And it was university professors who were involved in this. And we took a huge number of reporters, as I recall. My associate editor and I, Jeff Stinson, we spent spring break. I mean, Spring break, we stayed on campus to go through dusty files of expense records from this program and then calling up every place they said they'd gone and ask whether they actually gone there. And we found about $25,000 worth of expense vouchers that they hadn't put through. And this is back in the early 70s. Someone who was interning at a Kansas City TV station, WDAF, and somebody who was working for the NPR station on campus, KANU, had also become aware of this. And we decided to pool our efforts. And we did this sort of early multimedia, cross-media platform. We timed everything to come out all on the same day. Did what was good for broadcast on broadcast, what was good for print on print, all these other things back in the 70s. And we got 2 people sent to prison. And that's kind of when you feel, cool. We spoke up for these kids and these parents that were having trouble, that were being abused by the system, and we got something done about it. And that's a feeling that you can't turn your back on journalism when you see something like that happen.
Well, let's shift to a compelling story that had you in the middle instead of you as the reporter. It seemed like this should never happen in America, but in August of last year, 2023, police raided your home and the newspaper that you own there, the Marion County Record. The raid was condemned by free press advocates and journalists from around the world and seen as an effort to intimidate your paper into not publishing a story. Can you walk us through that day? What was that surprise like for you, and what was going through your mind?
It was totally unexpected. I was actually sitting at home at the time. I lived with my 98-year-old mother. I'd come down here to Kansas during COVID, come on spring break from the University of Illinois, and I couldn't go back to Illinois because of COVID. So I taught my classes from actually where I'm sitting right now, using Zoom and whatever else. And I did that for the rest of that semester and did it for the next year. And somewhere along the line, I said, enough with this online class crap. It doesn't work well. I'm close enough to retirement age. I'll just retire, and stayed in Marion. So I'm staying with my 98-year-old mother. And it was getting close to time. Her Meals on Wheels would arrive at about 11 o'clock in the morning. And I was waiting for her Meals on Wheels to arrive because it was usually cold and I'd heat it up for her. But got a knock on the door. There were a couple of cops out there that were executing a search warrant. And I told them at the time that this is probably not legal what you're doing, and that we have information about the police chief which we hadn't published, and we think this is just retaliation for that. It turns out it probably was a much more serious retaliation than just that, because they also raided the home of a city councilwoman that same morning, who was an opponent of the mayor. And we had covered her opposition to the mayor. And we believe that it wasn't just the police chief, but it was also the mayor who was out trying to get us and trying to either embarrass us, or in the case of the mayor, he had said previously that the only way I can get rid of her, because he tried to get her recalled and couldn't get it. She, on the other hand, had override campaigns on some stuff he'd tried to publish and been very successful with them, or tried to enact. But we thought that this was an attempt by the mayor to enlist the police chief and some others in a campaign to embarrass us, get her convicted of a crime, throw us out of business, prevent us from publishing. There were discussions at the time about, well, who's going to be able to publish the legal notices after they're raided, and we can't quite prove all of this yet, but we've heard enough of it that we think it was fairly broad-reaching. But they raided our office, and I tried to call. They immediately took my cell phone. They took my laptop. They forbade me to touch the desktop computer in the place, and I wanted to call a lawyer. Well, I had his number in my laptop. I had it in my cell phone. I had it on the desktop. And I also had it posted. Actually, it's still there. It's right on this wall over here next to my desk. And I now got more than one lawyer's number over there. But they wouldn't let us. I went down to the newspaper office. They wouldn't let us in the office. As it turned out, they stood at my mother's house for 2.5 hours. And eventually 7 of them came to my mother's house to take her computer away. They searched her basement, thinking there might be a file server down in the basement. And she's like, there's no file server in the basement. There's clutter, and I'm embarrassed, and I don't want you to go down there. But they went down there anyway. They took all sorts of things. They took everything that we had to produce the paper with at that time. They threw our staff out of the newsroom. I came down to the newsroom and couldn't get in. And I finally went to a neighbor who lives not far away from here, and I said, can I borrow your phone? And it turns out he had an old flip phone. And borrow your iPad to look up our lawyer's number so we could call the lawyer and see what was going on. But they packed up all our material. They took our file server. They took our backup hard drives. We had backups on Blu-ray discs. They took all the computers that had Blu-ray players on them, so we couldn't get any of our backups. We didn't even have, the newspaper has a nameplate up at the top that says what's your name. We didn't even have that. We didn't have that nameplate anymore, and we had to produce a paper. They eventually returned all this to us about 2 hours after we produced that first paper afterward. They could have returned it a little earlier, and it might have made it easier for us, but they didn't. And they accused us of identity theft. Now, the sad thing is that we had received a tip. Well, actually, to back up just a little bit, we'd been invited to a meeting, a public forum, by a congressman, and got a personal invitation to it. And we went there, and the owner of the coffee shop threw us out. Didn't want any media in the event, and threw us out, and had the police chief throw us out. In response to this, a woman who knew the coffee shop owner sent us what she thought was some dirt on the coffee shop owner, that she had been driving for 20 years without a valid license because she'd had a drunk driving conviction that she'd tried to have diversion put onto and never completed the diversion agreement. And the person who gave us the information said, not only has she been doing this for 20 years, local law enforcement are well aware of it and have done nothing to enforce it. So our first thought was, we didn't want to be Dan Rathered. We didn't want to have a fake document in our possession that wasn't real. So we wanted to verify, was it a real document? So we asked her how she got it. And she told us how she got it. And we went off and tried to find it, and we couldn't find it there. So we eventually called up the State Department of Motor Vehicles and said, well, how do you get this? And they told us how. They gave us the instructions on how you get the document. And, they knew what we were doing. They knew why we were doing it. So we got the document. We looked at it. It was legit. But we found from another source that really what was going on here, this had probably been leaked by the woman's estranged husband, who was arguing in their divorce case that he should get all their cars because she didn't have a valid driver's license. And we said to ourselves, this is not a story we want to run. So, but we were concerned that cops were not arresting her. So I sent off a note to the sheriff and the police chief saying, we've received this document. We aren't going to do anything with it. But there was an allegation made by the woman who sent it to us, who had connections with law enforcement. She'd been a dispatcher. Her husband is a retired state trooper. That the law enforcement was ignoring it, and that she might have obtained this record in some way other than the way she told us she did. We did not know at the time that the city councilwoman had also received a copy of this from the same woman. And the woman, the restaurateur, was asking for a liquor permit to sell alcohol at her restaurants. And the city council member sent a copy to the city administrator saying, does this affect her license application that she has this pending drunk driving conviction, and should she be getting a liquor license? And the city administrator said, Now that's for the state to decide. We don't look into that issue, and I've instructed the police department not to follow up on it. The police chief didn't receive our note until he'd gone home for the weekend. He saw it the first thing the Monday morning after that. And at some point, there was some discussion made that involved city council members. The only way they could overrule the city administrator would be if the mayor overruled him and said, start an investigation. The police chief started an investigation. It was a shoddy investigation. One of the police officers called the state and said, did somebody access this record? And they said, yeah, there's a loophole they can get this record through. And he didn't even bother to ask who the person was, what their title was. He got false information. Said, and right after that, the restaurant owner accessed this. We have a record that was accessed under her name. So obviously they had faked her name rather than using the name of the reporter, which is what was on the request for the document. Well, it turns out that all the transactions for a day are loaded as a batch once in the morning. So every transaction that had been made that day showed up as sequential, like 2 minutes apart. And it was different IP numbers, and it was the ex-husband of the woman making the request. So real shoddy reporting. They rush out and get a search warrant and wait a few days. How the search warrant, the county attorney said he didn't read it. The judge, who wasn't even the judge for here, she's a magistrate judge from a different county, approved it. We don't know why the judge from this county wasn't here and didn't approve it. We've asked whether she ever saw it. They won't tell us whether she ever saw the request. There was a complaint issued not by us but by somebody else against the magistrate judge for approving the search warrant. The state sent a note back saying, well, judges have almost total immunity to their action. And we don't say that we would have agreed with pursuing the warrant, but we have sent her advice that in the future we recommend that she reads things before she signs them. And there was a complaint made against the county attorney, and it was sent back that said, well, he didn't do anything wrong. He has immunity. Most county attorneys actually read search warrants before they send them to judges, but they're not required to, so that's okay. So kind of a catch-22 situation in trying to get culpability for this. So they raid our office and take all of our stuff, and we put out a paper. Eventually, the county attorney, prodded by some state officials, decides on the Monday after the raid that, oh, shoot, there wasn't probable cause for this search to ever exist. And so he makes a request, but waits till Wednesday to do it, to remove the search warrants and return all the devices to us. They had made a copy of our hard drive, which he didn't want to return to us. It was something that was added to the seized inventory after they gave us a copy of it. We only found it accidentally, and then they didn't want to return it to us. And they started going through, well, we should have the judge review it in camera. And then a judge finally sent down and said, read my original note. It said return everything now. And so
for the judge,
they actually smashed the hard drive. And we had the sheriff and the undersheriff with a hammer and chisel come in and take the little hard drive and smash it into little pieces. So we have a bag of pieces of a hard drive that is the return of that. And thereafter, it's just been a roller coaster of legal affairs and still pending, likely to be pending for years to come, lawsuits.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. And going through all that detail is sobering in itself. What happened inside you just as you're watching all this go on? What were you thinking as kind of what animated your actions at that point?
You're not supposed to do this. So I told him at the time, I said two things to him that were a little prophetic. I said, this is going to be a huge lawsuit. You're going to be sued, and you're going to be on the front page of the New York Times. And they laughed at that. Of course, they were on the front page of the New York Times, but they had a huge lawsuit against them, multiple huge lawsuits against them. But basically, you revert to your training, and you do what you're supposed to do, which is you orally challenge them. You do not physically challenge them. Otherwise, they will try to have you arrested. By the way, they tried to have my mother arrested, my 98-year-old mother arrested. And I didn't mention that part of the story, which I really should have. My mother was so distraught about this. The 2.5 hours she had to sit there with the cops and watch them ransacking her house. She would not eat that night. She would not drink water. She would not go to bed. She sat in a chair in the living room till about 6 in the morning and then finally went to bed. I let her sleep till a little afternoon, and I woke her up at that point and said, you didn't eat anything yesterday. You need to have something to eat. All through the raid, she kept telling them she was very, get out of my house. She said some great lines that people have appreciated. She was telling the cops, do you have a mother? Do you love your mother? Does your mother love you? And what you're doing is wrong, and Gestapo Hitler tactics. She really laid into it. And she one time approached one of the cops with her walker, and the cop involved wanted to have her charged with interfering with law enforcement, aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer for attacking her with her wet walker. Well, we've got video of it. I mean, one of the nice things is we didn't have to wait for body cam. I had a camera in that house in case she fell or something. And so we had video ourselves of what went on in there. And she's not threatening them. But the cop, by the way, who threatened to have her arrested, he's now the interim police chief in Marion. So we're not rid of these people. The notion of what did we do at the time, that's automatic. We put out a newspaper. It took us 2 all-nighters. We just did what we're going to do. That's programming. That's muscle memory. You just do it because that's what you're going to do. If there's heroism, if there's courage, the courage is we put out the paper last week with the same sheriff, the same county attorney, the same judge, the interim police chief now, who not only did that, but he was the one in searching our newsroom who went through a reporter's desk, a reporter who wasn't even here when the identity theft happened. She was sick that week, had nothing to do with the story. He searched all of her files and found she was the one who had the dirt on the police chief that we didn't use because we couldn't get documentary sources. We only had 2 sources who were related to each other. We actually had more than 2, but they were all related, and we weren't going to run it until we found an independent source that said that this guy who had been the police captain in Kansas City earning $120,000 a year suddenly decides he wants to go to Marion to be the police chief for $60,000 a year. Doesn't really make a lot of sense until you realize that he was pending demotion for sexual improprieties and other things that he had done at the Kansas City Police Department. And we had that information. We just didn't have it nailed down to the point that we thought we could publish it. But in going through the desks, the guy who's now the interim police chief found that file, called the police chief over so that he could read it, and page 1 of that was the printout of the LinkedIn profile of our main source. So he now knew who gave the information to him. So anyway, back to my mother. She was, I got her up at around noon on Saturday and said, you haven't eaten. She went to the bathroom. She came back to bed and was sitting on the edge of her bed. And I said, do you want to eat here? Let me make some breakfast for you, get you some coffee, get you something or other. Do you want to have it here in your bedroom? You want to go into the family room? You want to eat at the kitchen table? She says, I don't know. I don't feel to, and dropped over dead. She died in the middle of that sentence. The coroner came and said it was the stress of the raid. Other experts have described it as broken heart syndrome. It's fairly common among elderly people that if they believe that she'd worked at the newspaper for 60 years. She was still working there at the time, 98 years old. She did a column of memories for us. If you believe that everything about your life was meaningless and you're an old person, you often die of sudden cardiac arrest. And that's what happened to her. She'd spent most of the evening, where are all the good people? Where are all the good people who are supposed to stop this? Well, they came. It just took them a few days to get there. We got huge outpouring of support. You mentioned earlier that all the media organizations rallied around us, and we appreciate that. We're very grateful for that, but that's not what we're extremely grateful for. It wasn't the media organizations rallying around us that we cared about. It was the people. We heard from tens of thousands of just average, ordinary citizens, steam fitters, union executives, politicians, law enforcement officers in a very large number, retirees, school teachers, nurses, whatever. Tens of thousands of them sent us supportive email messages. Thousands of them actually subscribed to our newspaper from all over the United States. So we have our circulation tripled as a result of this thing. Most of them subscribing online only, and 100% of the notes we received were supportive. And they were coming from everywhere on the political spectrum. I like to recount the story that I was going through them one day, and I never got a chance to answer all of them because it was 10,000 of them. You can't do it. And we'd lost our computers, so most of this was like ganged up in this big pile of messages that we finally got to weeks and weeks later. But I was going through it weeks and weeks later, and I was looking, clicking next through the things, and I'm so sorry for what they did to you. It must have been the damn Republicans did it. And I clicked next, and it says, I'm so sorry for what they did to you. It must have been those damn Democrats. I mean, it was coming from every side of the political spectrum. Conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans, and they were all saying the same thing. And these days, to find an issue on which people of both parties and all political aspects agree on is rare. But they were agreeing on that this was wrong. This was just wrong. I think there's a sentiment of the public. There's a segment of the public that probably thinks journalism's an outmoded concept and it's technologically out of date, and none of which is true, and that it lies and fake news. But even the fake news people thought this was wrong, and fundamentally, I think they understand that there's an important role that the media, that news coverage plays in democracy, and that this is just not American. We were lucky enough, one of the awards we received is the Maria Ressa Award for Courage in Journalism from the University of Maryland. Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize winning journalist from the Philippines, was there, and I got to have lunch with her. And she'd been following our story from Manila. And I asked her enough questions that I know she'd listened to it on the first day before my mother died. Then she'd listened to it on the second day after my mother died. And she'd really been following it very closely. She said to me, the most discouraging thing about it was that we and the rest of the world had always looked to the United States as our beacon of liberty and hope. And this is the kind of crap that goes on in our third world countries. And here it's happening in the United States. And that was very depressing to us. And I'd had a grad student from Egypt. In fact, we'd done a paper together for a convention about the repressive control of the media in Egypt and how the media had adjusted to it. A little tactic they called incremental reporting. They'd report a little tiny bit of a story, and they'd wait a while and report a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, and they had to do it slowly, otherwise the government would come cracking down on them and raid their newsroom. Well, we did a paper on that and thought how awful that was. Well, that's what happened in Kansas. That's what happened in Marion, Kansas. Does it happen everywhere? It happens more than you'd think. One of the unusual things about us is we're not the only place this has happened to. We're the place you've heard about. You've heard about it partly because we are a little different than other places. I don't take a salary here. I work 80 hours a week and don't get paid, but I'm retired. I've got plenty of income. I don't need this. This is not why I'm doing it. This is not my livelihood. And I will not object to somebody whose livelihood depends on it, that they got to feed their kids. They got to get them through college. They can't challenge everything as fully as you need to. I've been in that position. I remember sitting in a newsroom when an editor was making a decision that I didn't think was good, and that my boss at the time didn't think it was good. I was a new father who had a 6-week-old baby, and my boss said, well, if you do this, I'm going to resign. And he did. And it's like looking at me and, okay, I can't resign right now. I just can't do it. But now the tail is turned on this. I'm now in the position where I don't have to, somebody wants to boycott me and put no ads in this newspaper. That's fine. We'll live with it. We'll figure out a way to make it work, because my financial livelihood doesn't depend on it. And so you're hearing about this one a little more than you might hear about some others.
Well, you put together that issue right after the raid happened, and you got it out anyway with kind of a headline that went around the world: seized but not silenced.
Yeah, that was a headline that just came to me. I don't know why. I'm a longtime headline writer, so I come up with headlines. But it was important to establish the notion that we were not giving up. There are some other sayings that I said at the time, we're going to publish come hell or high water. There's no way that if we had to take Post-it notes and handwrite the news on it and send them on people's doors, we were going to publish a newspaper that way that week. There just was no way we weren't going to publish. You can't be, when you're confronted with bullies, you can either bow to them or you can stand up to them. And most of the time, if you stand up to bullies, they go away. And you just have to realize that there's a minute that's going to be difficult when you're standing up to them. But standing up to them is a lot better than rolling over, because the next time it's going to be something worse. And the next time, they want your lunch money this time, and they're going to want your car and your house the next time. So you have to kind of stand up to bullies, and that's what we wanted to do. I mean, that's what newspapers are supposed to do. That's our role in democracy.
Well, you've certainly set an example, and if it's all right, I'd like to wrap up with a couple of questions about that example and your thoughts for a rising generation who might be interested in the path that you've taken. You've had a chance to teach journalism in a college setting. What were the most important couple of lessons that you wanted students to absorb above anything else when you taught?
I'll tell you, the mission of journalism is important. That you're out there, it was offered originally as an insult to Chicago journalists, that you comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. That was actually supposed to be an insult, but it's actually a pretty good definition of what we do in journalism. You have to have a soul. You have to care about the community you're living in. One of the reasons why journalism typically attracts more underrepresented groups to it than most other professions do is because I think a lot of those people in those groups have that passion that they understand that there's a community that needs their services.
And they want to be heard, right?
They want to be heard. You need to give a voice to the voiceless, and make sure that this is not stridency. And most people don't understand this who are not in the business. I am very Jeffersonian. I believe that if the public has all the information, most of the time they'll make the right decision. Now, not all the time. And it might not be the decision that I would make. And honestly, I don't care. Most people don't think that's true. They think, well, you write editorials and you care what they're going to do. Well, I care, but I'm not trying to push an opinion down anybody's throat. I just want you to have all the information, make up your mind yourselves. You might be right, you might be wrong, but at least you knew that you had the information going in. And it's important for students to understand that that's what you're doing. The challenge that most students face is the ability to go up to people and ask them questions. To be willing to look stupid, to ask a dumb question that you don't, you have to, and to talk to people who aren't like you. I mean, but that's also the beauty of it. I mean, and go to a town that you don't know anything about. I've got a job applicant coming in next week who's graduated from the University of Chicago, not exactly a major melting pot, who'd gone to a very prestigious private school in New York as for undergrad, lived in New York City, has probably never seen a town as small as this, he's coming out to come to a town like this. That will be good for him if he comes to this town. It'd be good to experience a place that you've never felt like, to be part of the flyover state when you've flown over it so many times, or to go to some other place, to go interview people. I remember interviewing somebody in a small town, and they were so proud of their accomplishments. He's in management. And I said, well, what are you managing? I'm the assistant manager at Burger King. Well, but in the mindset of the people involved, you have to put yourself in those shoes and understand that's a big accomplishment for those people that were there doing that. And just being a sociologist, being the Margaret Mead of your society, just for your own personal edification. I mean, I understand this is a time at which liberal arts education is not looked on with a great degree of support. People are renaming liberal arts colleges as arts colleges rather than liberal because they don't like the word liberal is to them a negative term. Understand that knowledge is important, and this is the business you're in journalism, is the knowledge business, finding information, and you've got to be willing to go up to people who you don't know, who may look scary or may look intimidating or may look like you don't like them, and ask them a question that they may find stupid. But do enough research so that you don't do that intentionally. You're not just going up and saying, what do you think about global warming to a scientist who does studies on global warming? Do some research and figure it out, and revel in that research. One of the little things I learned one day teaching, I was making reference. I said, I don't know whether anybody knows about this, but there's this stupid show on TV. It's on one of the Discovery channels or something. It's called How It's Made. And it's a Canadian show, and it's like spends 5 minutes about, why potato chips come in the bags are only half full, and how you make cornflakes. And the people around the class, they'd all watched it. All the good journalism students had watched it, because it's sort of this meaningless knowledge that you can get quickly, and maybe you're going to use it someplace in the future, but it's the love of acquiring information and then sharing it with other people. And if you've got that, you need to be in journalism, because that's a job that's what it does. That's the joy of telling people things that they didn't know, and finding out things that are important for them to know, and then letting them know, and taking that thrill and figuring out at the end of the day, you've done more for democracy than most of the people who are elected to offices have done. And that's a good feeling. It's a really good feeling. And even though I was fascinated with journalism, I didn't get that till I was a senior in college, till I went out there and actually did journalism in a community that I was identified with, my campus newspaper. And I recommend to students that they get that experience. They work in a community that they're part of, that they can feel that coming out, and they'll be hooked. They'll be hooked for life. It's not about writing. It's not about photography. It's not about design. It's not about being, having the best hairdo and doing the news on camera. It's about what you do for democracy.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. And Eric, you and your mother and what you've all done together at the Marion County Record certainly, I think, are going to leave a legacy for our country, and its legacy of freedom, and the humane legacy, what we share together as neighbors and citizens. So I want to thank you for what you've shared with us today, and especially for sticking with it on a day.
And don't forget to stick around at the end of our program, where we'll be announcing the National Civics Teacher of the Year. We are so grateful to all of our partners and sponsors, including SmartPass, who sat down with Justin Goldstein, my colleague, to talk about their sponsorship this year.
Hi, I'm Justin Goldstein. I'm Director of Corporate Relations at the Bill of Rights Institute. I'm thrilled to have Peter Lewis, CEO of SmartPass, join us today. BRI is honored to have SmartPass as our official sponsor of the National Civics Teacher of the Year Award. Peter, welcome. And if you could just tell our audience of teachers and students and school districts out there a little bit about yourself and SmartPass.
Sure. No, thanks so much for having me, Justin, and a little bit about SmartPass. So, I'll give the quick, backstory and then kind of get into how the actual product works. Around 6 years ago at this point, my assistant principal of my high school came into our coding class and was like, hey, I have this idea for a digital hall pass. Students are going to the bathroom or nurse's office or just wandering around the hallways every single period throughout their school day, and there's no way to stop it. Our school had just gotten Chromebooks that year. So as just, techie high schoolers, my co-founder and I, we were like, hey, there has to be a better way for all of this. So we scrapped together the first version of SmartPass, just a very basic, when a student raises their hand to go to the bathroom, they open up their Chromebook, they say, hey, I'm going to the, second floor bathroom. A countdown timer starts, and then the teacher from the front of the room can see that, hey, this student has been out for 5 minutes right now. And when the student comes back, they just click end on that stop pass. And when we rolled it out to, the earliest version of SmartPass, we rolled it out to our school. Teachers loved it because they had visibility on what was actually happening throughout the school day. And it actually really reduced the amount of time that students were just wandering around classes every single period. We kept on working on SmartPass just as like a side project all throughout college. And then post-COVID, as schools started coming back, there was just an uptick in student behavior issues, and then almost every single school went one-to-one. So it was like right place at the right time. We went from around 50 schools to over 1,000 schools in about a year. Absolutely exploded, and we've just been growing SmartPass just as quickly as we possibly can.
What would you say inspired SmartPass to sponsor the National Civics Teacher of the Year Award?
I think, helping educators is really just at the heart of everything we do. And it brings, our entire company who, has a lot of even former educators, some who are using SmartPass at their buildings come. And there are tons of other SmartPass, tons of other, sponsorship opportunities out there. But we wanted something that, actually directly helps teachers and then just raises awareness for all of just the amazing work that they do. I'd also say this sponsorship just helps us build the stronger connections with teachers. We're always looking for ways of how can we become more and more and more involved in the classroom.
This past summer, our student fellows traveled to Washington, D.C. and the streets of Philadelphia to ask some questions about our constitutional principles and things that they really cared about. Let's see what they had to say.
I'm Mark Rozell. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in Virginia. And my background is in U.S. government and politics. I'm a political scientist by training, and I'm absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to answer questions by the Student Fellows of the Bill of Rights Institute. So let's get right to the first question.
Hi, my name is Gianna, and I have a question. What are some landmark Supreme Court cases that have significantly impacted our interpretation of the Bill of Rights?
That's a great question, Jenna. Thank you. The Bill of Rights is a cornerstone of American democracy, outlining fundamental rights and liberties. The interpretation of these rights has evolved significantly, though, through Supreme Court cases. To take a few examples, in Tinker versus Des Moines back in 1969, the court ruled that students wearing black armbands to protest the war in Vietnam were engaging in pure speech, which is a form of symbolic speech protected by the First Amendment. So this case affirmed that students do not lose their constitutional rights to freedom of speech when they enter school, emphasizing the importance of protecting free expression. Another important case, Terry versus Ohio, 1968, addressed the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, the court found that a stop and frisk by police is considered search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. However, it ruled that this practice is allowed under certain circumstances, especially in crime prevention. So the decision recognized the balance between individual rights and the need for law enforcement to maintain public safety, allowing evidence seized during such stops to be accepted in court. So these cases demonstrate how the Supreme Court shapes the interpretation of the Bill of Rights.
Hi, my name is Vicky Ramaswamy, and I'm a first-year fellow here with the Bill of Rights Institute. My question for you today is, how do groups like grassroots movements and special interest groups have in influencing how the Bill of Rights is protected and interpreted on a day-to-day basis?
Well, thank you for that question, Vigeesh. Let me answer. Grassroots movements, special interest groups, and lobbyists play significant roles in influencing how the Bill of Rights is protected and interpreted on a day-to-day basis. Grassroots movements such as the Civil Rights Movement, the women's suffrage movement, have long been at the forefront of efforts to expand and defend our constitutional rights, such as the right to vote. Now, these movements often garner support and momentum through advocacy campaigns, organized demonstrations and protests, and encouraging civic engagement within communities in America. Special interest groups typically advocate for specific rights, such as the rights to free speech and due process. Groups such as the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Rifle Association have been influential in shaping judicial interpretations of the Bill of Rights through litigation and lobbying efforts. Lastly, lobbyists work directly with lawmakers to push for legislation that strengthens or weakens various constitutional protections based on their interests.
Hi y'all, my name is Anthony Kim and I'm from New York. And my question to you is, how does the Bill of Rights affect the daily lives of American citizens?
Thank you for that question, Anthony. All 10 amendments included in the Bill of Rights affect the daily lives of American citizens. The Bill of Rights protects basic rights that American citizens are entitled to, even if you don't realize it. On a day-to-day basis, the First Amendment may play the biggest role in your life. The First Amendment protects the right of American citizens to exercise free speech, free practice of religion, freedom of the press. So that means in day-to-day life, Americans can communicate and speak how they would like without fear of government punishment. It also means that the government does not censor newspapers and media outlets. Additionally, the First Amendment guarantees that Americans of all faiths can worship as they please, or not at all, without interference from the government. In more serious circumstances, the Sixth Amendment becomes crucial. If you are ever arrested, this amendment guarantees your right to a fair trial. This includes the right to be informed of the charges against you, the right to a speedy and public trial, the right to an impartial jury, and the right to have legal representation. The Sixth Amendment ensures that the justice system operates transparently and fairly. These rights are designed to protect individuals from abuse of power by the government and to ensure that justice is administered fairly. These liberties protected by the Bill of Rights are fundamental to American life, but it's important to remember that not all countries guarantee such rights. In many parts of the world, people do not have the same freedoms of speech, press, religion, or the same legal protections if accused of a crime, for example. The rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights are a key part of what makes the United States unique in its commitment to individual freedoms and justice.
Hi, my name is Peter Kennedy and I'm from Westchester, Pennsylvania. And my question for you is, why is civil disagreement important and how can we simultaneously prevent political polarization in our communities?
Great question, Peter. Civic disagreement is important in a healthy democracy because it allows people to express different opinions and engage in debates that can lead to important policy changes, better decision-making, and increased political participation. It is essential for a functioning democracy to respect and encourage civic disagreement to allow for the inclusion of diverse opinions and prevent the marginalization of minority voices in the democratic process. In the United States, the form of government plays a role in providing the guide rails for civic disagreement. In the Federalist Papers, for example, James Madison argued that a large republic would be better able to control the effects of factions, that is, groups of citizens with different interests, because the diversity of opinions and interests would prevent any single faction from dominating. Madison believed that the competition of ideas in a large republic would lead to more refined and balanced decisions.
Why is civics education so important?
Thank you for your question, Naomi. Civic education is important for helping to foster and develop informed and engaged citizens. Civic education helps teach people about their individual rights, how government works, how they can be active, responsible citizens. By understanding the structure of government, how laws are made, and the rights guaranteed by the Constitution, people can be empowered to take an active role in our democracy. So this knowledge fosters and helps students understand the importance of voting, staying informed about political issues, contributing to the community through service and civic engagement. Inside and outside of the classroom, civics education encourages critical thinking. This helps people to analyze and understand complex societal issues and reinforces the idea that each person has the power to make a difference. So I think that comes to the end of all of our conclusions. I just want to thank the students for their excellent questions and encourage them to continue their studies in American government and politics. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. You are the future, and I feel very good about it, getting to know you through these opportunities to answer your questions. Thank you.
The Bill of Rights Institute Student Fellowship is a really wonderful opportunity for high school juniors and seniors to create a community, really, of young people from across the country. We select 20 young people from our application pool, which opens this October, and they are invited to come with us on an intellectual civic adventure. We meet monthly to talk about important ideas and what's meaningful to them. And then at the end of the summer, we all come together in a civic city. Usually it's Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, and it's completely free for students. So I recommend you, if you're a young person or if you know a young person who's going to be a junior or senior this upcoming year, apply today, and we'd love to see you in the Bill of Rights Institute Student Fellowship.
Absolutely. And speaking of inspiring, I had the opportunity to go down to Monticello recently, where our president, David Bobb, sat down with Jane Kamensky, who is the president at Monticello, and they had a conversation about Thomas Jefferson, his relationship with John Adams, and the nature of civic friendship. So let's take a look and see what they can teach us today as we think about how it is that we overcome disagreement.
Dr. Jane Kamensky, thank you so much for joining the Bill of Rights today.
So happy to be here, David. Thanks for coming down to Monticello.
It's a pleasure to be here. You've been with Monticello as president since early 2024. Can you tell us just a little bit about your journey to joining this institution and how you got here?
Sure, happy to do that. So I left the classroom to come down to a much larger and in many ways more public classroom. I had been in Research One institutions in higher ed for 3 decades. When the search firm looking for a new president and CEO for Monticello reached out, and one of the things that I had been doing in my university teaching was looking to build two-way bridges between scholars and teachers and the general public around questions of historical and civic importance. And this felt like a way to answer that call at scale.
Excellent. You know, one of the things that I'm intrigued by your background is that you've written 3 biographies, I believe, 7 books total, award-winning. You note in one of your biographies that writing such is like a portrait, and you're writing about a portrait artist. Could you just tell us a little bit about the craft of writing a biography?
Sure, and Monticello is a biographical site. One of the things that I love about the genre is the ability to take large, abstract questions about huge historical forces, and route them through one person's life and think about the ways that we make history as individuals, but also that history makes us. And that always is a dynamic process. I think it works in similar ways for great men and women and for ordinary people like me. We're products of our time and we shape our time through individual action. I'm an accidental biographer. The first biography I wrote started out as a history of coffee consumption in the United States. And I found that the stories were sort of routing through one place and then from one place to one individual. And I found that kind of life and times / times and life genre of biography a way to open up big questions. And that is precisely what Monticello does, right? It's the home of Thomas Jefferson and the family members who lived with him in the house and the enslaved people who built the place and made it run. So it's biographical, and it's also a cohort study of people who didn't necessarily want to be together. And I think there's no story about the American founding and the ongoing working out of what it means to live in a republic that you can't see through the eyes of those people, looking at each other, looking at the world, looking backwards, looking forward. So I believe in biography as an enterprise. I'm also interested in it as an ethical enterprise, right? You want to write about somebody in ways that are profoundly true and evidence-based, and also that would allow them to recognize themselves, right? So to me, as a biographer, to get somebody right means that you're bringing the analytic lens of your own moment, but also thinking, if John Singleton Copley, my artist, read this, or his mother read it, would she recognize her son? I'm not limited to her or his worldview, but I want to think through them in a way that has the integrity of as close to belonging to their world as one could get.
That person might recognize themselves in your portraiture. One of the challenges I can imagine as you're doing this kind of accidental or serendipitous and then it becomes intentional is that there's an enormous amount of research that you can do for anybody. In this process of writing a biography, how do you know when you're done?
Oh, I mean, I always think of that scene at the end of A.S. Byatt's historical novel Possession, where the characters go to their graves concealing a crucial secret that the historians who are our protagonists, literary scholars who are our protagonists, never learn. So it's never done, right? Like you accept that there are always going to be gaps in your understanding. History and biography are dynamic processes. Working on biographies in the olden days, the evidence is pretty limited, right? So we also deal with the fact, and this is true in Monticello's work as well, that there are things that you would like to know that you never can because people didn't document themselves or weren't allowed to document themselves in the case of the enslaved community, or perhaps destroyed things that were private to them. Biographers tend to love things that people in living their lives hate. For example, we love it when families are separated because they have to communicate with each other. Whereas living a long and happy marriage in one household, as my husband and I have been privileged to do, we haven't left a lot behind about our daily lives communicating with each other. But John Singleton Copley and his wife separated by the Atlantic in a period of revolution, they left letters, and that's a great gift. Their pain is a great gift to the biographer.
And speaking of pain, it's also the case that sometimes as people are sifting through their life's letters that they decide to burn them, right? And then historians are left with less to work with.
I think we're always, even in 20th century work where there is an unscalable mountain of just volume of documentation, but there are always gaps that we can't see, right? I think of those pots in art museums where people are putting together sherds, and in the contemporary practice of restoration, you show the gap. You don't make it look like a facsimile of the thing. You show the blank terracotta where there would have been figuration. I think there's something similar in historical writing. And in interpreting in a site like this where we have to be able to say, we think this because of X, Y, and Z, but we don't know this because people didn't talk about those things or because so-and-so was known to destroy their letters. It's always tantalizing when you get a record that something was destroyed.
Gaps that we can't see might be a good segue into Thomas Jefferson. We're here at Monticello. Who was Thomas Jefferson?
Thomas Jefferson was our greatest philosopher of human liberty on the western side of the Atlantic. He was a polymath, interested in questions of law and governance, in architecture and music, in natural history and wine. He was a person of profound paradox, right? Our greatest philosopher of liberty, who was himself an enslaver of more than 600 people over the course of his lifetime. And to give it that extra sort of spiral twist, who knew that slavery was wrong. So who was painfully aware of his own paradox and contradictions. I think this makes him a very important figure both to appreciate and to think with. Jefferson is good to think with, not only about his own accomplishments and limitations, but about the ways in which we are all creatures of paradox, incompletely understanding our world or understanding it well, but not able fully to act upon it, and striving in our different ways for transcendence, right? We all like to believe that we have done something that will endure, even though all evidence suggests the contrary. I think Jefferson could not have predicted in 1776 that second paragraph of the Declaration, beginning "We hold these truths," would be the piece of his life's work that endures. And it both encapsulates a man and his paradoxes and massively transcends an authorship, a time and place, a purpose of that document. So I think he's also a good person to think with about human contributions and the ways that the text escapes the author, with profound and ongoing consequences for our experiment in self-government.
That's fascinating. So Jefferson can be a mirror for us. I'd like to explore that more, but you mentioned the arc that Jefferson in 1776 might not be able to see, what a profound, lasting effect those words he penned and were joined by others in endorsing what became the Declaration of Independence. Do you think by the end of his life he had an inkling that those things might be among the most important that he ever penned?
I think, his selection of accomplishments for his tombstone is in addition to elements of correspondence where he reflects on the Declaration and its ongoing importance, but he curates a life of preposterous accomplishment down to three things for his tombstone: writing the Declaration of Independence, of which he then calls himself the author, crafting the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and founding the University of Virginia. His time as Secretary of State, his work in the Continental Congress, in the Virginia State House, as ambassador, as President of the United States, none of that makes the cut. So I think he realizes that it has achieved profound and enduring importance, lives to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, a moment of great celebration in the United States. But in 1776, the young, redheaded 30-something is just taking a committee assignment that he doesn't particularly want, and acting, he says, and I think says both rightly and with a little bit of legerdemain, acting just as a scribe for "quote unquote" the American mind. So it's I think about this when I'm called on to serve on some committee that I don't want. Is this going to be the Declaration of Independence? Probably not.
Yeah, what an incredibly productive committee. And perhaps the Constitutional Convention, where Jefferson was not, was one of those places where actually committee work left a profound legacy. I think of 3 months of committee work, most of that let's consider that a sentence or sort of not something that we'd look forward to. Jefferson had, throughout his lifetime, a really interesting relationship with John Adams. One of the things that we're exploring this year with teachers and students and our fellow Americans is how we live together with disagreement. Freedom makes possible disagreement.
And disagreement makes possible freedom.
Exactly. Can you talk just a little bit about the relationship that Jefferson and Adams had together? What characterized initially their friendship? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about what led to that friendship breaking down.
So they come up together in the imperial struggle. Adams in Massachusetts, Jefferson in Virginia. They know of each other from writings, but none of them has ever met before the Continental Congresses convene in Philadelphia. There's wonderful letters, especially from Adams, about what it's like to meet those Virginians with their very strange mores. And I think their initial encounters and the correspondence around Congress reminds us that these are people from 9 and then 12 and then 13 separate republics actually getting to know the opportunity for a common peoplehood through that encounter. They both believe that the precious rights of English liberty have been encroached upon by Parliament and then especially by the King, and they are brothers, allies in struggle. And Adams, who is first tapped for that committee, tasks Jefferson as primary author, I think because he knows he's a good wordsmith from Cause of Necessity of Taking Up Arms and other previous documents, but also because he knows how important it is to have somebody who speaks from that other Republic of Virginia if the thing is going to carry unanimity in the Congress. They are first together in struggles over coalition, right? There's the editing process of that committee of 5, and especially the 3 lead authors of Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams in that committee of 5. And then there's taking it to the broader Congress and hammering out some of the things that that Jefferson held most dear, right? His paragraph about the international slave trade and the responsibility of the King of England as he saw it for foisting that pernicious institution on the colonies was something he believed in passionately, and it was just line after line after line excised. So compromise is painful, which is one of the things that their friendship is forged in, is this painful institution of compromise that also allows for human flourishing, right? Like no compromise, no union, which is the struggle in 1776, again, as the Articles are working their way through between 1777 and 1781, and then again with the Constitutional Convention, again with the Reconstruction amendments. So a relationship forged in compromise that then comes apart over toxic partisanship, right? They are some of the original partisans in the contested election of 1796, and then again in 1800. They have widely divergent views about what will lead to the flourishing of the young United States, whether it's sort of mercantile and financial and routed through England, or whether it's idealistic, rural, devolutionary, and admiring of France. Jefferson takes the side of France and small government. Adams, a more imperial and financialized view of the United States, and it comes apart hotly to the point where Adams doesn't attend Jefferson's inauguration. They both believe in the peaceful transfer of power, a crucial American principle, but Adams can't quite bring himself to witness it in a period of profound family sadness as well as political sadness, and they go their separate ways. And the relationship is knit up beginning a dozen or so years later with an exchange of letters where they decide over time and over a frank and polite, respectful exchange of views that they have more in common as believers in the American project than they do dividing them. I was reading some of those letters recently and was interested in the role that family plays. It's often the case for me, when I sit down to do cross-ideological work, which I believe in, and which is one of the things that I think brought me to Monticello and which Monticello models, if you're looking for a place where you can see commonality in your hope for the world, Ask about somebody's household and what they want for the next generation. And it starts that way. Hey, I was thinking about your kids. And they rebuild enough trust to talk profoundly about issues. They don't smooth away their disagreements, but they do find that civic friendship that allows this wonderful epistolary correspondence, well published. It's easy to find it out there in modern format, to flourish to the end of their lives, right? They die on the same day, which is an almost too good to be true ending. You wouldn't believe it in a movie. And they both die loving the country, even though in some ways their visions for it remain as dissimilar as they were in 1800. And even though both are a bit rueful about the way that things have panned out. They also die knowing that they can't quite keep their hands around the thing that they have created. More comfortable for Jefferson, who really believes in ceaseless experimentation, than for Adams, who was a formalist in a whole set of ways.
The point about family is so interesting, I think. Abigail Adams, in their long correspondence with John Adams, seemed to have oftentimes a little bit more prudence, shall we say. She was more temperate, more willing to say, well, really, does your ego have to lead the way here? And very few people could say that to John Adams. What role did she play, if any, in your reading? They had 1,200 letters, among the richest of the bodies of letters in a republic of letters. What role did Abby play in the reconciliation?
So initially she keeps them apart, right? I mean, she is the protector of her husband and partner in a marriage that is more of a true partnership than many we see in the pre-modern era. And while she has been a fiercely loyal friend of Mr. Jefferson's in the 1770s and 1780s. She's quite protective of John early on, and is a little bit of a brake on their reconciliation. So I think you see the shaping hand of family on the Adams side through the wonderful correspondence of that family held at Mass Historical Society.
Who else played a role, because there were intermediaries that were operating, right, between the two of them in the reconciliation? Can you say a little bit about how that kind of détente first happened? All right, we can at least think about being, because they were never in the same room, right, after the breach. They maintained this increasingly vibrant correspondence. But were there other parties that were helping to kind of bring that détente to being?
So I really can't speak to that, right? Like not out of any secrecy, I just don't know it well enough. So let's, but if ask it as like, how is the medium of letters important? I'd love to talk about that for a minute.
You've talked a little bit about this incredible repository of letters that we have across this entire era. What significance did it hold as a whole for the time, and also for this kind of rapprochement between Jefferson and Adams?
So people referred to Western civilization at this time as a republic of letters, which meant the printed page, but also the importance of candid epistolary exchange. Jefferson wrote over 22,000 in his lifetime, and kept his outgoing as well as his incoming correspondence through the polygraph machine. And I think in the rapprochement between Adams and Jefferson, the form plays a role in that it is so mediated, right? You sit and think about what you're going to write. When you look at an 18th century quill pen and a piece of 18th century woven paper, this is not a speedy technology. So it's reflective. You're thinking and editing yourself. You might have a waste book where you're crossing out what you don't mean to say. And then between Charlottesville and Boston would have been a week in each direction on a good day, right, if the post road wasn't washed out by mud. And so when you receive something that makes you feel hot, you have a moment to step away from it and not fire something. They're not tweeting at each other. I think that's really important. I like to think that they could have made it up in the same room, but the distance initially, I think, really helped. You can see in the correspondence that they answer each other pretty rapidly. That Adams doesn't let a letter from Jefferson sit for weeks. But if there's a message for us in our current partisanship, I think the Republic of Letters says, take a beat, take a breath. A strategy they often use in their exchanges that we think about in our civic education work together, ask a question. And the letters encourage modulation that way. Sometimes an archaic technology is better for civic life.
That's such a great point. I think of many other parallels, in the rise and kind of tempestuousness leading up to the 1800 election, which if people have not read about this, you really should. It is an incredibly incendiary thing with allegations that were just as scurrilous as anything that's being sent forth back and forth now via Twitter. How do we draw from the stand down from that in this civic friendship? That's such an important term, civic friendship. It's a category right now that seems almost beyond our reach in our era now. If you think of that pitch that you reach where everything is political and it's very difficult to get beyond the partisanship, there are certain steps that can be taken. Does the friendship, the restoration of the friendship of Adams and Jefferson, tell us about some practical steps? You just pointed to one of them. Think before you attack. Maybe don't attack at all, right? Let that moderation as a virtue lead the way rather than your haste to get out there and be what Amanda Ripley has called a conflict entrepreneur. How do we step back from the precipice that we're at right now and say we actually want to reverse ratchet? Because we've ratcheted very high now into this extremely hyper-political, polarized moment. How can we stand back, and what do Jefferson and Adams teach us on that front?
I mean, I think they start from a basis of trust, and they return to a basis of trust. And part of that is recognizing that there are crisis entrepreneurs standing between them, right? I mean, one of the things that I think about in my own civil discourse work is who doesn't want this conversation to happen, right? Part of the reason that we are so polarized is there are tons of incentives to polarization, right? Not just the dopamine hits that any of us who are on social, I'm not, get from that rush of negative affect. But there are funding streams that attach to in-group passion rather than coalitional solidarity. So think about who benefits when we are polarized. And Jefferson and Adams initially fall out because of the partisan press in large measure. There's a wonderful book, which you probably know, called The Tyranny of Printers, using the contemporary 18th century phrase by Jeff Pasley at University of Missouri. There's a widespread acceptance that the newspapers are partisan organs, and Adams seeks to control them, and Jefferson initially doesn't, but is bit pretty hard by the partisan press. So one of the things that they recognize is how badly they have been served by being whipsawed by the 18th century news cycle, which is, as you said, much slower, but just as passionate. I think the starting one-to-one and in small groups, right? Like it's really hard to build trust on a platform. One of the things that I love about the ways that civil society organizations like Braver Angels or Stand Together or Living Room Conversations are proceeding is trying to find people in small groups where they are to take a small risk with somebody else. And then they start small. Right? How's your son doing? I was so sorry to hear, or I was so delighted by his advance in this quest, rather than let's dig right back into the pain point. I guess the last thing I would say is, and you and I have worked on this together through Educating for American Democracy, to think about and teach the virtues of coalition, right? That the virtues of abridging some of what you want to get more of what you need, and figuring out what the things are that you care about, that the largest number of people who disagrees with you cares about, and how you can have that conversation with them in a language that embraces you all. So I think Jefferson and Adams got to a point where they were looking for something other than the maximum infliction of pain. Right? The opportunity to inflict pain was always there. Is more available to you with someone that you have trusted and loved than it is with the stranger through the screen. And stepping back and thinking that there is a higher possibility than winning the point, I feel like that's fallen out of favor in the way we conduct our classrooms, the way we conduct our political campaigns, the way that we conduct our social lives, and we would be better following Jefferson and Adams on that path.
Cruelty sometimes seems to be the point today, right? Owning your whoever your enemies are, right? This has become part of our lexicon even. Media bubbles are no modern innovation, right? You just mentioned the kind of tyranny that could beset those who used newspapers as weapons. How do we as individuals, whether we're omnivores and we're trying to consume a lot of news, or we're right now really fearful or just tired of it, how do we begin to challenge ourselves to read other things? You know, one of the things that I loved about our work together in the project that you mentioned, Educating for American Democracy, is that in our first halting steps, we had to do a lot of getting to know one another and getting to know even the terminology. What are we going to call this? What is our country called? Is it a constitutional republic? Is it a constitutional democracy, the term that we landed on? All of that kind of navigation helped to build some of those bridges. But it was clear that many of the people who were participating in what became quite a large effort of hundreds of individuals were open and had to be open throughout to the idea that their world, their media bubbles had to be expanded, and that they'd made a practice of that. I fear that one thing that we're facing now is that people are embracing the idea that, hey, I'm in my bubble and I really like being in my bubble. How do we begin to pull people?
It's dangerous out there,
It's
right?
dangerous out there. Yeah, you couldn't possibly trust or start reading the rival, whatever the rival might be, media. And it seems like we're going to have to take some of those first halting steps in order to be able to rebuild those bonds of trust.
So I think there are media organs that are taking that as their mission now, right? Like I think The Atlantic has a noticeably plural chorus of serious voices, right? So I guess I'm thinking about how we look for the places. I at Monticello and in my own historical and civil society work, I am a center-out person, and how we find and broaden centers rather than, oh, you're listening to MSNBC, you should listen to One America. And I think that maybe fuels a cycle of rage where you're just oscillating back and forth. Who is trying to do the good work of hearing each other, and then asking people you're in conversation with, what are you reading that you care about that I'm not reading? I'm amazed at the number of people I talk to about, who do you read in the New York Times op-ed page, who will say like, oh, I will never read Douthat. I only read Krugman. And it's like, well, what if you didn't read Douthat or Krugman, but you read David French all the time? Or Margaret Renkel, his state mate, and thought about those places where people are really reaching to be heard by people who are not in the tent. I also think centrism has a bad name. I know this from my children, right, who have told me they hate centrists more than the radical extremes, which is just broken, right, and which is precisely what I'm a huge fan of the research enterprise More in Common, right, and their Hidden Tribes report tells us that's exactly what's going on, is that the leftmost 8% and the rightmost 12% is driving 75% of the conversation. To loudly embrace the crafting of centers and the moving out from centers in coalitional politics as a way forward in a self-governing country. And if we can find historical exemplars that show us they took this path and it worked, and they took that path and it failed, then I think we have successful ways of bringing a vital past into a fractured present.
It's a beautiful vision. How do you foresee Monticello playing a role in that kind of work? Because every day you welcome visitors here, and every year there are tens of thousands that come to Monticello. They are from every walk of American life. They're thrown into tour groups. Sometimes they might exchange ideas over the course of these wonderful tours. If people have not been to Monticello, I hope everyone hearing this will come to this amazing place. The tour guides are electric, and the place is electric. You have an opportunity perhaps to inject some of this civic dimension that you said at the outset of our conversation has so motivated you. What do you want Monticello to do as part of this kind of re-centering, if you will, of the United States of America?
So I think that is our huge opportunity, right? We serve over 300,000 people a year on site and about 10 times as many online. And as you suggest, they come from every state in the nation, many zip codes within that state, within those states. They're not sorted in the ways that we tend to be in our workplaces, right? Sorted by educational level or by political tribe, by zip code, which is the most profound sorting in American life. And we deliver consistently across that broad audience hard history told with integrity and backed up by evidence. So I think as teachers, we're modeling evidence literacy, we're modeling bravery, right? You should be able to talk about hard things and know that not everybody in the room is going to agree with you, and think about that as a virtue. To me, the secret sauce will be if we can encourage people more often to talk to each other. We are piloting a tour for 2025, 2026 semi-quincentennial season on the politics and partisanship of the early national period, biographically themed around Jefferson and Adams. We know from visitors that they want to learn more about the politics of the early United States. I also think it's comforting to know that it has been this bad before, and the work of ordinary humans can make it better, right? So it's a lesson that we are not the first hyperpartisan age. And then what we want to do following these tours is offer Jeffersonian feasts of reason, where we invite people to sit down, break bread together, and have a facilitator who is trained in cross-ideological conversation, ask people to contemplate questions like, what do you love about the United States, and what embarrasses you about the United States? What do you want to change? As in our conversation about Jefferson and Adams building on family familiarity, build out from food, right? And there is a Feasts of Reason card deck. It's recently been digitized for us with civic ed partners that starts with sort of appetizer questions, right? Like, you know, what are your favorite foods? What do you dislike? And builds to, can we talk, to strangers? Can we talk to strangers about the things we care about in this country? I would boil all that down to saying, I think that Monticello is a place that can face boldly the deep and meaningful divisions of our past, right? Like the division over slavery is not an unfortunate sideline. It is a meaningful decision about the morality of the United States. So that can face those things head on, but can also think about the we in We the People. You know, if we're going to recover the center, we have to believe that it means something to be a people, as well as 50 people, 50 states, as well as infinite tribes and households within those states. So I hope we can set a literal table that will help us reinforce the importance of the we and help people discover it. You know, I guess my fantasy would be that people who go through such an experience might exchange phone numbers. Right, like let's keep this up as a text chain. That would be the kind of small victory that if people took that breadcrumb back to their communities, it's an ongoing connection to us, good for business. But it's also, maybe it's a seed and not a breadcrumb. It's something you can plant and think about how to harvest and share in a community.
Jane, the reason I think that your vision, which is a bold and beautiful vision, can become reality is that same study that you cited, More in Common, points to the fact that the people that are kind of in the middle, not on the extremes, are deemed the exhausted majority. But they're exhausted by what we have now, not by each other, nor by those hard conversations. In fact, I think people want them. We know that from our teachers. We know that from our students all across the country, and the teachers and students that Monticello serves. I would venture to guess that they similarly want to have those conversations and are eminently capable of them. I hope the Feasts of Reason, the Jeffersonian feasts, can lead to a time, we've as a nation kind of given up on Thanksgiving in a way. The idea that people can come together as families even and say, well, let's talk about something other than, sports are great, but that idea that, well, you want to talk about anything other than religion and politics. And maybe religion and politics don't have to be at the center. But being able to say, let's talk about those things which might divide us because we're bigger than those divisions, I think is something that can be much more than just a pipe dream, but a reality. I think there's evidence that points in that direction. I'm so glad that you're pursuing that vision. Can you tell us just a little bit about this exhibit that you're planning, and will it be touching mainly on the election of 1800 and kind of what led up to it, or we'd love a little preview if you might offer that.
We're gonna dig into how parties were formed, right? The fear of faction that the founders events in the discussion around the Constitution, and then the hyperpartisanship of the 90s and early 1800s. So following Jefferson's political career after the nation, right? It's not just the stroke of a pen. Declaration is obviously preeminently important here, but the Declaration lays down an ideal and destroys an old order. It does not create a new one, right? The working out of that new one takes the rest of Jefferson and the founding generation's lives and is ongoing, right? We're still, what we're describing is still that work of working out the founding. Like all tours of Monticello, it needs to work through the geography and the collections in the house. So asking questions like, why did Jefferson keep busts of Adams and Hamilton, his preeminent political rivals, always in plain sight? Why did he collect the death mask of Oliver Cromwell among the treasures in his library with this harbinger of how republics can turn into tyranny? So like biography, a house tour thinks very concretely, look at that and think about this large dynamic. I think one of the things we can teach on this tour is what healthy parties look like, right? What are parties for? I think you could ask that question on any street in the United States and not get a convincing answer unless you were talking to a political scientist, right? Parties are supposed to organize our differences in ways that that don't immediately go to the most profound cleavage and then crack the whole glass. So what are parties for? How do they undermine their own work? How are they functioning by the end of Jefferson's life? What did it mean to be a Democratic Republican, as he called himself? What did it mean to be a Federalist and then a Whig? So I think working through the collections in the house and the sight lines that Jefferson crafted and the stage setting of his own epistolary life, which is at the center of the tour, where he wrote his letters and copied his own letters, can tell that abstract story in a way that has a material and biographical center. We talk a lot about the power of place here, and I think if one of our questions in civic engagement, civic disagreement is, how do hard stories land best? I think in a beautiful place where you can think through a small corner of a big thing. And, you know, looking at the fact that Jefferson's bust of Adams is staring at him through his whole life, that he's collecting a lineage in his parlor that includes the great thinkers of the English 17th and 18th century, the explorers of the continent, and then creating a lineage of the first presidents of the United States. What are the stories about the Republic and its fractures and futures that he's trying to tell? I hope this will have, you know, be full of pregnant analogy, right? We're not going to talk in this tour about the hyperpartisanship of the 21st century, but it should ramify.
Jane Kamensky, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. It was a total pleasure. Happy Constitution Day.
To you too.
There's a lot of takeaways from that conversation I think are really important, but what I want to zero in on gets to the heart of our theme for the day. Jane said that freedom makes possible disagreement, and that disagreement makes possible freedom. I think what she meant by that was the idea that when we're all working together, we all have different ideas about how we can get something done. We may have different political ideas, but it may be as simple as different ideas on what we want to have for dinner. How do we come to an agreement where we can all move forward? What does it mean to do that within a constitutional framework? That was part of the conversation earlier today that Yuval Levin talked with Tony Williams about. What does it mean to come together? And I think it starts with trusting each other and seeing that value in each other. And again, that's that idea of civic friendship. How do we see the best in each other to try to find disagreement, to try to overcome disagreement, and to move forward in a way that's beneficial to all of our society? I also really like Jane's comments about writing letters, because it was both about writing letters, but also about the process of what it means to engage with our fellow citizens. It's important to take a step back, to think about what you want to say, and then to go through the process of saying it, but in a reasonable way, not just reacting, but finding a way, in the form of letters at least, of writing it down, carefully considering it, and then sending along. And of course, thinking back to those days, it took a long time for a letter to go out and come back. And that whole time, you're waiting for what their response is going to be. And you're trying to anticipate it when you're writing the letter. That I thought was really important, because in today's age, we get information rapidly. And it's important to always take a step back and to think about it. I think that really helps with us in overcoming some of these disagreements. It's not about just what that person might be saying, but it's about the idea that they're presenting. How can we get beyond sort of a personal exchange where we get sort of excited, but get to a place where we can actually have a dialogue to discuss and to overcome some of those disagreements? Constitution Day is really about looking at the foundations of what makes our constitutional system work. And I'm really excited to announce that we now have a new opportunity to do that for the elementary grades. BRI Junior is a collection of elementary lessons, and we're going to take a deeper look at that right now.
Welcome to BRI Junior, our K-5 programming, where history and literacy come alive to inspire young learners. From crafting paragraphs to drawing insightful conclusions, our curriculum empowers students to explore themes and perspectives, while mastering essential literacy skills like identifying text structures and understanding point of view. BRI Junior resources are a journey through U.S. history to build literacy skills and practice civic virtues. They'll investigate primary sources, engage in debate, art, and writing, and build the skills of citizenship. Enhancing our lessons are vibrant animated videos that immerse students in historical narratives and make learning both engaging and impactful. Whether decoding the past or creating their own stories inspired by American heroes, these activities and lessons deepen comprehension, spark curiosity, and help teachers create a vibrant classroom. Explore our resources today and discover the power of learning with us.
Hello, young historians. Today, we will embark on a journey to uncover the secrets of the U.S. Constitution. Let's see how the pieces of the Constitution fit together to shape the government we have today. In a land not too far away, 13 states made up America, but the people there faced a big puzzle: how to create a government that would be just, protect them, and be controlled by the people. Remember, the United States created its first government in the Articles of Confederation in 1777. It loosely unified the states, but this new national government lacked some key powers. The federal government was too weak. Problems emerged because of this weak national government. Many began to think this could threaten the survival of the new nation. Men like James Madison, George Washington, and others put their heads together to solve the puzzle of how to keep the states independent, but unite the states more under a stronger central government. Imagine a room in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, filled with brilliant minds like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. They were the problem solvers, brainstorming ideas to craft a brand new kind of government. These men had a big job to do. They were the architects of our nation's future, putting their heads together to build something incredible. Through long and hot summer days and nights, these men talked, disagreed, debated, and argued with each other, slowly finding common ground and compromises. These ideas were like puzzle pieces, fitting together to create something great. One of their important discussions involved the legislative branch, or Congress. This branch of government would make the laws. In 1787, one important question was how many representatives each state got to have. States with less people tended to support an even distribution of representatives, each state getting the same number. Many larger states preferred allocating representatives based on population, so states with more people would have more representatives. Southern states also wanted their enslaved populations counted toward representation. A compromise was achieved. This is often called the Great Compromise. Both sides got some of what they wanted. The plan for equal representation for states would be enshrined in the Constitution through the Senate, with 2 senators per state. The plan for representatives, based on population, would come to life in the House of Representatives. This compromise included counting every 5 enslaved individuals as 3 people for counts of population. These 2 branches would make up the legislative branch. In 1787, after much debate and collaboration, like the Great Compromise, they signed the Constitution. Let's flip through the Constitution's pages to see how it assigns and limits government powers. The Constitution created 3 branches of government, just like 3 puzzle pieces. The legislative branch makes laws through the Senate and the House of Representatives. The executive branch enforces them, and the judicial branch examines the law. Imagine a scale that keeps things balanced. Each branch watches over the others, so they don't become too powerful. This is called checks and balances. This was the remarkable tale of the U.S. Constitution and its role in shaping our government. Like a puzzle, its pieces were shaped to fit together to define our government and unite our country. Our story for today ends here, but the story of history is still being written by us. Keep exploring and see how you and your learning community fit into this puzzle.
I love seeing resources for the younger learners to work directly with the principles of our Constitution. It's so powerful and so important, especially as we know that young people love thinking about ideas of fairness and responsibility and friendship and really applying those directly to our systems of government and the Constitution. I'm so grateful that we now have these resources to share with teachers around the country in elementary classrooms. So thanks to your team for putting all this together.
Yeah, absolutely. The team did an incredible job putting these together, and I hope that many teachers find an opportunity to take a look at them, check them out. They're on our website now. But it really is an opportunity to begin engaging in a lot of these important civic lessons at a younger age, at the elementary level. And, civic leadership is something that we should all take to heart. And our next guest has a lot of experience being a civic leader and a leader within the government. And that, of course, is Dr. Condoleezza Rice, who our president, Dr. David Bobb, had a chance to sit down with. And they had a great conversation about what it means to be a leader and how it is that our constitutional system brings us together. And so I hope that you'll enjoy their conversation.
Dr. Condoleezza Rice, thank you so much for joining the Bill of Rights Institute.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for the great work that you do.
You've called America an extraordinary experiment. How is our experiment going?
Well, let's start with the fact that at the end of the 19th century, not too many people, the 18th century, not too many people were thinking that self-governance was possible. They certainly didn't think that it could be carried out by asking their citizens to have their passions and their interests go through these abstractions called institutions, a constitution. These were really pretty radical ideas. The remarkable thing is that they basically have served us well for the entire history of our country. Ours was a country that was founded as a slave-owning country. And yet now the descendants of slaves found their rights a first time with the emancipation and a second time with the civil rights movement of the 60s through this Constitution. So I would say that while the American experiment is still, and perhaps will always be in its experimental stage, there is a lot to be proud of and a lot to be grateful for.
Our American experiment is about self-government. What does self-government mean for our everyday lives?
I like to think that the founders gave us great institutions through the Constitution. They gave us structures like the idea that there should be separation of powers, but then they gave us a set of rights. Those rights, though, were accompanied with an expectation of certain responsibilities. And so that brought us, the citizen, right into the midst of what self-government meant. It meant that we were not just to exercise our rights without regard for what that would mean for the larger project. And so I think it's a remarkable thing that we actually think of the Constitution as our personal protector. I have a friend who is German who said to me, the problem with you Americans is you have rights and you think you have to exercise them. I said, yeah, well, that would be us. But it's really the Constitution. When you think about the fact that if I think you violated my rights, I will take you all the way to the Supreme Court. Brown versus the Board of Education. How many countries can say that their citizens believe it's their personal protector? But with that comes a responsibility to respect those institutions, to care and nurture about them, to teach about them to future generations, because that's the only way that this experiment works.
I love that idea of personal protection and that ownership that each individual can have. Thomas Jefferson used the phrase everyday citizenship. Yes. And his fellow Virginian James Madison talked about a parchment barrier. You've been a Secretary of State, National Security Advisor. You've seen the constitutions of so many countries. You're an expert on Russia. So many have written down these protections that are supposed to be personal but have no teeth in them. They're just parchment barriers. When you look at our country today, we know, and looking at the kind of our country in comparison to others, that freedom is fragile. When we have the freedom to disagree, we also have the tendency as Americans to pull apart. How can we Americans learn to disagree better?
We have to learn to disagree better because, again, Madison and the others would have thought of politics as constant contestation. You're always it constantly in a contest of ideas, but you can't have a contest of ideas if I refuse to listen to you, if I refuse to take your views into consideration, if I refuse to refute your views in a civil way so that we can share data, we can share evidence, we can have a, a discussion, a conversation that is not going to send us to our corners simply yelling at one another. And I think, unfortunately, these days we have a little too much of that. Some of it, yes, is the effect of social media and the internet. There's a kind of anonymity to it. There is a sense that you can go to your own tribe. I can go to my aggregators, my websites, my bloggers, my cable news channels. Maybe I never actually encounter anybody who thinks differently. And now when I do encounter them, I think they're either stupid or venal. And we have to make sure that we're not staying in our own tribes, our own echo chambers, where we never have a chance to disagree agreeably.
You lead the Hoover Institution, and under your leadership, you've recently established the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions. What do you hope will come from this work?
The reason that we wanted to have a center for revitalizing American institutions, so we wanted first to remind everyone, we sit in a university, and so reminding students, reminding faculty who are responsible for passing on the stories and the views about the Constitution, that these are living institutions. They're not just something that they wrote on a piece of paper in 1789 and then 1790. It was all kind of agreed to, and then it went onto a shelf someplace. You have a responsibility when these institutions show that perhaps there's trouble. We know, for instance, that only that 35% of Americans don't trust their elections. That's a really bad number for a constitutional democracy. We know that the views of Congress or of politicians or of the media or increasingly of the military are sinking in the "do you trust them" category. And so it is our responsibility as citizens, as scholars, as students, to take responsibility for trying to revitalize them, to understand, first of all, what's going on, but also responsibility to actually try to do something about it. And so we think by studying these concerns more deeply, trying to shed more light than heat on them, that perhaps we can get back to a day when Americans really do trust these institutions, because it's David, it's all that holds us together. We're not held together by nationality or religion or ethnicity or creed. We've come from every corner of the earth. There are people who are Muslim and Christian and Jewish and nothing at all, and we're all Americans, but it's this creed that holds us together. And so we have to protect it and defend it and extend it and revitalize it from time to time.
I so appreciate that emphasis on responsibilities. Historically, civil society has helped give rise to some of the most really enduring American institutions. What needs to be done to revitalize civil society?
Let me start first with what's really great about civil society in America. And in that, I would include non-governmental institutions, because one of the first things that the founders did was they left a lot of space that wasn't inhabited by the government, that was supposed to be the people or the civil society. And, you know, when de Tocqueville came to the United States in 1835 to understand these Americans, as he called them, he was a bit puzzled by what he called these voluntary associations that got together just to do good. Today, we would think of them as the Red Cross or Boys and Girls Clubs or Rotary Clubs. That's a vibrancy of democracy. And when I was secretary and I would go around the world, I would say, really make sure that that your civic culture, your civil society is really thriving. And one of the first things that authoritarians and dictators try to shut down is civil society, because they believe they can control the levers of government, but they might not be able to control citizens who have organized themselves just to do good. And so I think our civil society is our great strength. I often say to my students, if you want to be a part of democracy, it doesn't mean that you have to go and work in Washington, D.C. It can also mean that you're going to tutor at a Boys and Girls Club. It can also mean that you're going to start a Rotary Club once you move to a new city. It can also mean that you might work at the state or local level, because the founding fathers didn't put everything in Washington, D.C. I always jokingly say, they kind of put the federal government in a swamp between Virginia and Maryland, and they went back to the state houses where they thought all of the action would be. And so we have a vibrant tapestry of institutions, a really robust infrastructure of institutions. And to practice democracy, you have to use them all.
Giving young people a vibrant technicolor view of what that tapestry means is part of the mission of the Bill of Rights Institute. We've been pleased to work with you and the team at the Hoover Institution to create some videos and lesson plans that help tell that story of the tapestry, and also what it means to not just think about civil society as an abstraction, but to, like you said, jump in and recognize that as a young person, you can make a difference, and you can do so not just by going to Washington, D.C. In fact, the real engine of our progress has been, as you just said, in these institutions that grow, these movements that really grow from civil society. You've pointed to the importance in our conversation here of responsible leadership. To have the revitalization that we all seek and that you're endeavoring to study and lead with this new center, what kind of leadership really is going to make a difference here?
The leadership that is going to make a difference is first and foremost to recognize that leadership is not a destination, nor is it a job description. It's something that is earned. The trust is earned. The belief is earned. Again, I tell my students, start small. Don't walk into my office and tell me, I want to be a leader. Go and organize your dorm for something. That's an act of leadership. It's also leaders, and this is really true of democracies, leaders have to recognize leadership characteristics in others, because pulling together for the common good is what sustains democracy. When you think about authoritarians, what do? Well, it's all about them. They draw all of the attention and all of the power to themselves. The problem is, if you're going to be omnipotent, you'd better be omniscient too. And very few human beings are all-knowing. So democracies are strong because they have leaders throughout society, because they have people who've earned the trust. And I sometimes wish that we had a little bit more humility in some of our leaders. Maybe, as I get older, the past always looks better. There's something about that. But I would just say, if you want to be a leader, start with humility, that leadership is not something you were born to. It's something that you earn.
That's such great advice for young people. And that's really where we wanted to conclude our conversation today. You gave us just some practical advice that we can share and emulate for young people. They come to you looking for questions about, how do I become a leader? You're saying to them, start small, start in your local community. If there's one other thing that you wanted to leave those students, particularly who are joining us today, with, please offer some counsel and advice as they're looking to be on that path where they can be part of this movement to revitalize American institutions.
I am so grateful that you give us this opportunity to talk with students and to advise them. We've been through a lot, and we've made our own share of mistakes as leaders, and you will do that. But don't be afraid to go out and to put yourself out there to help your fellow citizens in one way or another to achieve goals. But you also have a responsibility to know something about what you're doing. I often say to my students, before we try to solve that problem, why don't we try to know something about that problem? Why don't we recognize that there are competing views about that problem? Why don't we recognize that just because I think it, it may not be so? And so it goes back to something that you mentioned about disagreement and doing it agreeably and listening to people who have different opinions. One of the strengths of democracy is that we have both that right and that responsibility to debate, to bring new evidence, to bring new thoughts. We don't have to just take the dictate of the government as the word, which is what happens in authoritarian regimes. And I think it's a protection for us because while sometimes democracy is a little frustrating, we may think, why can't they get something done? Well, those authoritarians can get something done very quickly, but very often it's a big mistake because it's the thinking of one person, not the thinking of the society as a whole. And so I would say take the time as a student to really delve into problems, to really understand them, to travel if you can to other places, because nothing will really give you confidence about what the American experiment is and where it's going than to go to other places where they don't have the liberty and the freedom that we enjoy, and then come back determined to make sure that this experiment continues for the generations beyond you.
Dr. Rice, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your time today. And thank you for everything that you're doing to help bring this, not only Constitution Day, but the revitalization of American institutions to fruition.
Thank you.
We are so appreciative that Dr. Rice took time to sit down with Dr. Bob. And their conversation is just so inspiring to me, especially in the way that they were talking about how our institutions really bring us together and unify us in a diverse country, especially because, again, we all have disagreements that we're working to, I wouldn't even say overcome, although I said that at the beginning of the show, it's less that we're overcoming them, it's more that we're working through our disagreements to find productivity. And that takes leadership, which Dr. Rice talked a lot about, takes good civic leaders, but it also takes non-governmental institutions, the things that hold us together in civil society. And something that someone that I know that you have thought a lot about, Rachel, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America in the 19th century, thought a lot about what is it that is in our communities that brings us together?
And what are the institutions that we have as Americans that help us fortify that disagreement across difference, right? That it's never going to be the case that Americans agree on basically anything. We have starting with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists up until today, there are vast differences in what we think the role of government is, what we think the role of the individual is, but there are institutions that we have that let us coordinate and cooperate and flourish across those differences. And it was so interesting to hear Dr. Rice's take on those, but really throughout this whole program, how we really are built for this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important that we are, because again, that our ability to disagree about things, but still come to a consensus and move forward as a country is really important. And it's something that civic education has a lot to say about.
And that's why it's that time in the program, we are so excited to introduce the 2025 National Civics Teacher of the Year. Here it is. The Bill of Rights Institute National Civics Teacher of the Year for 2024-2025 school year is Shari Condit from Woodland High School in Woodland, Washington. The Bill of Rights Institute was on hand at Woodland High on September 10th to surprise Shari with the award at a special assembly. Shari has been in the classroom for more than 20 years. She is a national board certified teacher and a former James Madison Fellow, and is beloved by her students and colleagues. In her essay for the competition, Shari wrote, "I believe that it is my responsibility and the responsibility of all civics educators to create momentum so that young adults transition from classroom students to engaged members in a free and just society." Congratulations to Shari Condit, the Bill of Rights Institute National Civics Teacher of the Year.
Thank you so much for joining us for another Constitution Day, where we've looked at the theme of debate, dialogue, and the Constitution, and how that system, the Constitution, helps us come together even through our differences.
And the message really is perennial. It's something we talk about pretty much every year on Constitution Day Live, but it feels especially poignant this year. There's so many conversations about how divided we are and how different Americans have become. But I think over the course of today's program, we've really tried to focus on how we've come together. You know, there's so many different opinions and works and things that Americans are trying to do with their lives. And when you think about it, we're doing okay.
Yeah, you know, Yuval Levin used the word hope, and I really like thinking about it that way. Our institutions give us an opportunity to recognize the value in each other, to work to find some common ground, to build coalitions that can all work towards our common good, our common benefit. You know, I hope that that's a message that you take away from today's program.
Across the different segments, we had discussions about the history of difference with Dr. Kamensky. We had leadership and our responsibility when we encountered a difference with Dr. Rice. And you have the Bill of Rights Institute, our resources too, that really help you think through, how do we do this? How do we continue to perpetuate institutions across seemingly more and more difference?
Absolutely, and what does it take to stand up for our rights when needed, like Eric Meyer did in standing up for freedom of speech? And so I hope today that you'll take that message back to your own constituents, your own communities, your own classrooms as you continue to investigate and learn more about the Constitution and your role within civil society.
So thank you so much for joining us for Constitution Day Live 2024, our 5th year of Constitution Day Live. Kirk and I are so grateful that you've taken the time, and we look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you so much.